Now the proceedings are being held up by the music chosen by Rob, I think. Ladies and gentlemen, we are about to start the luncheon session on time and expectations in economics. And we'll do this in the order that the participants are seated. So the first speaker is Sheila Dow, and I hope you'll welcome her.
How much time do we have?
10 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I want to talk about the degree of confidence that we have in expectations rather than expectations themselves. In other words, I want to talk about uncertainty. And just to be clear, what I mean by uncertainty is unquantifiable risk, something that's not susceptible to quantitative calculation. Now, there's a heightened awareness of uncertainty because of the crisis. It's very much part of the public discourse. And of course, at the height of the crisis, we saw concrete evidence of uncertainty in the freezing of markets and the inability of markets to set prices. But of course, since then, uncertainty has continued to be an issue. And it matters because where there's uncertainty, there's an unwillingness to commit. There's an unwillingness of firms to commit to capital investment. There's an unwillingness of banks to commit to loan contracts. There's an unwillingness of households to commit to borrowing and expenditure themselves. And so this is an important policy issue. If we want to get a recovery going, then uncertainty needs to be tackled. It's also important for economics. The fact is that mainstream economics largely avoids talking about uncertainty. This is less true now. It's coming into the literature more, but what's meant by uncertainty within this literature is, in effect, quantifiable risk in very sophisticated forms, but still quantifiable risk, or some kind of exogenous shock. Now, what I want to argue is something a little different from what's normally discussed in terms of uncertainty. There's a large literature of long-standing about the effect of uncertainty on behavior, and there are several people here at the conference who've made important contributions to that literature. But the aspect I want to focus on today is not so much behavior as the structure on which behavior is based. And what I want to argue is that uncertainty actually affects that structure as well as behavior, which lends even more force to the argument that it would be very helpful for policymakers who have to address these issues if economics were to develop in such a way as to pay much more attention to structural issues. Now, structural change is often given as a way of explaining why uncertainty arises in the first place. If we understand the economy as an open system, then it's susceptible to non-deterministic change in structure and in the interrelations within that structure. And so uncertainty arises because of changes in institutions, changes in conventional practices, changes in conventional understandings. And of course, it arises from creativity new developments in products, markets, technologies, which could not possibly have been anticipated in any probabilistic analysis. Now, if in fact uncertainty is as pervasive as this kind of analysis implies, how on earth do we cope with it? How does society manage to function in the face of this uncertainty? Well, there's a whole range of coping mechanisms, and a lot of these coping mechanisms actually arise through structural evolution. In other words, attempts to deal with uncertainty themselves cause changes in structure, which ideally have the effect of reducing uncertainty rather than increasing it. So we have had evolution of institutions, which can be understood in terms of addressing uncertainty. The evolution of the state itself can be understood in Hayekian terms as something which provides some sense of order as a basis of decision-making. Similarly, the evolution of money and the developing relationship between central banks and commercial banks in providing societies money addresses uncertainty by providing a safe asset, a good basis for contracts. Conventional practices, too, have evolved in order to help us address uncertainty. If we think of routine market behavior, it can't always be represented by calculation. Market behavior is fundamentally based on conventional practices which have allowed trust to develop, and this underpins the whole market process. Conventional knowledge, too, is something which evolves as a way of helping us deal with uncertainty. There's a limit to how we as individuals or governments or institutions can forecast the future because of uncertainty, and therefore we deal with that by building up conventional judgments. And that provides a further basis a stable basis for decision-making. And uncertainty, too, can be understood as the foundation for creative activity. This is uncertainty in its positive sense, that it's the excitement of the unknown which encourages invention and innovation. I mean, we as economists enjoy new ideas, and the whole notion of pushing ideas forward. And that excitement is due to the uncertainty of taking a step into the unknown. But there's a further coping mechanism which may not be so helpful and indeed can create the conditions for raising uncertainty instead, and that's ignoring uncertainty. Now, ignoring uncertainty isn't always a bad thing. We'd never get up in the morning if we were focusing on uncertainty all the time. So uncertainty is helpful. Ignoring uncertainty is helpful in allowing us to act. But the problem arises when we ignore uncertainty in the face of logic and experience. And we can see how that departure from logic and experience led to the current financial crisis. It created the conditions for an increase in uncertainty, although the purpose of ignoring uncertainty was to reduce it. So if we think of how markets behaved in the run-up to the crisis, there was a build-up of overconfidence in the capacity of markets to price risk, and a great unwillingness to face up to the consequences of all the new products that were being developed and the way in which markets were behaving. Now, central banks are inevitably faced with uncertainty. It's very hard to avoid uncertainty if you're a central bank. You have to take action in spite of uncertainty. But nevertheless, because there wasn't a focus on the uncertainty that was dealt with by institutions and practices, the behavior of the authorities also contributed to the build-up to the crisis. If we go back to the 1970s, there was the process of deregulation, which meant that the banks, which had been franchised to supply society's money, were now much larger operations engaged in a much wider range of activities than traditional retail banking. There was an attempt to rein that in with capital adequacy requirements, but now these requirements are based on the quantitative models which banks themselves have developed, which ignore uncertainty. So embedded in that system is an encouragement to ignore uncertainty. And then, just as the retail banks were moving away from their part of the deal in supplying society's money, central banks raised the possibility that they might not stand behind the retail banks if they got into difficulty. And this punctured the confidence and trust within society in bank deposits as money, which is quite a sort of drastic step to allow to happen. And of course, we've seen very recently the reaction to the initial proposals for Cyprus. Now, for economists, there is clearly a duty to provide guidance for policymakers to help them deal with these issues. In other words, because I'm arguing that the kind of structures and practices and conventions that were built up over centuries to provide a stable basis for private sector activity, because these have been threatened, it's important for the authorities to try and readdress institutional structure, conventions, conventional understandings, conventional practices, in order to try and bring us back to a more stable environment. Now, economists are subject to uncertainty just like anybody else. I mean, our knowledge is uncertain, and therefore we have to rely on conventions within the discipline. And we can understand different approaches to economics in terms of different sets of conventions. Now, the set of conventions adopted by the mainstream, which dominates the discipline, is to ignore uncertainty, or if to pay attention to it, just to regard it as something temporary which will go away after the crisis and can then be ignored. But there's a range of other approaches to economics which can provide the kind of guidance that's required to understand institutions, the evolution of institutions, the evolution of different practices, the whole notion of trust, how society deals with uncertainty, and each school of thought can bring a different type of contribution to the table. So there's scope for guidance there. And what I'm arguing is that because of the structural consequences of uncertainty and the need to pay attention to structure in order to address uncertainty, then this adds further weight to the argument that there should be much more scope for drawing on a wider range of approaches to economics. So this is an argument for pluralism, that the judgment behind policymaking will be more robust the more different approaches are drawn on and different ideas brought to the table. Just as a pluralist methodology would help by bringing different methods, some room for modeling, of course, but also the kind of methods that allow us to analyze institutions and practices and getting a handle on what's actually happening within the real economy at the time. So I come back to end with the argument for methodological change within economics in the direction of pluralism. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
The other day I happened on a quote that I thought fits this session. And it says, almost all the other fellows do not look from the facts to the theory, but from the theory to the facts. They cannot extricate themselves from a once accepted conceptual net, but only flop about in it in a grotesque way. This quote comes from Albert Einstein, which lends it a certain amount of authority. But of course, Einstein probably knew absolutely nothing about economics and was better for it. Still, the thing about flopping about in the conceptual net in a grotesque way seems to be with us in our subject too. So, Roman, your turn.
It's going to be a little hard to defend the theory after this introduction, but I will try. So I'm honored to be here, and I'm particularly honored to present this at the INET meeting and be on stage with George Soros, because Michael Goldberg and I have come finally, after quite a struggle, to understand how George's ideas can actually be combined with the ideas of Bob Lucas and Tom Sargent. So I'll try to persuade you at this hint that that may be a way forward for us, which is in the spirit of this INET meeting, where after the period of criticism, maybe we should move forward to reconstruct. So that's would be my objective here. Can I have the, no, I can't see it there. Can I get the slides here? I mean, yeah, thank you. So let me first tell you what our agenda has been with Michael Goldberg recently. We've come to the view that unless we reclaim the rational basis for economic thinking, we'll actually never reclaim theory and we'll never reclaim the profession. The profession will never actually accept the situation where the assumption of an economic model is that individuals persistently and systematically go up against their objectives all the time. So the pure behavior approach cannot be the future. The profession faces a problem that the rational expectations approach somehow has not worked, and yet it has persuaded itself that there was rationality. So what is our resolution to this problem? Our resolution to this problem is not that the market participants are irrational, but that the economist's model of rationality has very little connection with rationality in real-world markets. And in this paper that we prepared for the talk, for which I have very little time, we actually attempt to provide a replacement for the rational expectations hypothesis, which we call contingent expectations hypothesis. So I'm going to walk you through the argument very quickly. I will begin by making very clear what macroeconomists called rationality. That is extremely important because there's been a lot of confusion about the rationality is about people being able to calculate exactly, whereas if you as I will indicate, that definition is not really what is rationality in macroeconomics. For macroeconomists, an individual is rational if she uses her understanding of the way the economy works in making decisions that do not conflict with her objectives. Note how broad that is. The objectives don't have to be profit maximizations, but they need to be objectives. And we're going to start actually with John Muth, Robert Lucas, and Thomas Sargent, something new for me and Michael. So for us, that's new thinking. We've never actually started a paper with John Muth, Robert Lucas, and Thomas Sargent. Namely, that explaining regularities in time series data and understanding the consequences of government policy require that models of aggregate outcomes are compatible with rational decision making, in a sense in which I just defined this. So that would seem like a hopeless definition, because after all, people understand the world in many different ways. So how could an economist capture an understanding? Muth's striking insight was that an economist model could serve as a basis for representing the markets, the aggregate of its participants' understanding of the economy. And it was his simple logic. Actually, the most amazing thing in this research is that every time one reads Muth's paper, it repays 10 times. The number of insights in that paper have long been forgotten and are definitely worth going back to. So what is the idea? The idea is that an economist model, after all, is supposed to explain regularities in the world and be the guidance for government policy. If the economist model were to do that, and we were to attribute to market participants, represent their understanding of the economy in a way that was incompatible with what the economist model predicts, then of course they would assume that either the economist model is irrelevant, of course then there's nothing for us to do, or that the participants ignore what the economist model in some sense predicts. And now the rub is, of course, in what that model is, on the basis of which we make the assumption that the individual expectations should be coherent with. That's where everything is. In fact, that's the missing link in moving forward from where we were, in understanding the market, understanding the state, understanding regulation. And the two possible models. One class are determinate models. They specify in advance all potential changes in the market's understanding of the process driving outcomes. Those models are the models of contemporary economics. These are the models, in Sheila's language, in which the economists themselves ignore the imperfection and fallibility of their own knowledge. I hasten to add that economists have done a lot to have models in which individuals' knowledge is imperfect. Individuals have imperfect information, learn about models, all of those things have been done. This is different. This is acknowledging what George would call the fallibility on the part of the economist. And that's where in our opinion, resolutions of many puzzles, including practical puzzles, potentially lies. Then we have the second class of models, which are the partly open models. I need to explain the word partly. If you have a completely open model, it has no implications for time series data. In fact, Sheila, in a paper to a volume that I co-edited with Ned Phelps, enlightened us to something extremely important, Sheila Dow, that the opposite to the closed model is not necessarily a completely open model. You can open the model in many relevant dimensions and have it a model of the open system, and yet it could actually constitute the basis of formal theory. And this is the line that imperfect knowledge economics pursues. And actually this paper is part of the INET program on imperfect knowledge economics that we are very grateful for INET to support, obviously. So what is the story about rational expectations? They're based on determinate models. They rule out any unanticipated changes. What's the usual criticism? Market participants do not actually forecast according to an economist model. Axel had something to do. I wrote a paper about this early on, and Axel, who is here, is another kind of a poignant moment, had something to do with the publication of that paper in the American Economic Review. I used to believe that this criticism is fatal, that the fact that this has nothing to do with the way people actually behave is actually sufficient to refute rational expectations. There was other criticism around that time by Roger, for example, that there were serious coordination problems, that individuals couldn't coordinate on the economist model, that this kind of unanimity, which is almost Orwellian, could never be achieved. Michael and I have come to the view that this criticism will not take us forward. And actually, our position now is that the proponents rightly argue that the REH models are not literal descriptions of how individuals behave, but abstract approximations of the outcome of an admittedly very complex market process. So the starting position is that everything is an abstraction, and therefore, how do we then take it forward? So the next question we ask is, if everything is an abstraction, then we don't have to get bogged down with kind of a Milton Friedman discussion about, everything is in the realism of the assumptions. We don't dispute realism of the assumptions, because everything is meant to be a representation. So the next question is, what are the rational expectations models abstractions of? And here Karl Popper comes handy. Bob Lucas once commented to me that IKE must be philosophy, and I tried to argue with him that it's economics, so now we are in the final stage of that, where philosophy is going to become economics. So Karl Popper had shown analytically, if there is such a thing as growing human knowledge, we cannot anticipate today what we shall only know tomorrow. REH models are models that make precisely this assumption. Therefore, the abstractions of the world in which knowledge does not grow. Note the paradox. The whole raison d'etre of rational expectations revolution was that participants' knowledge is what's going to vitiate government action. They will absorb government action, there will be an ineffectiveness of government action, and the problem with the earlier Keynesian models was that they did not take this sufficiently into account. Now, as we study this a little more carefully, it turns out that REH models are also models of the world in which knowledge does not grow. Notwithstanding that, there is still a possibility that REH models might be abstractions of the world in which knowledge does grow. It doesn't follow from that, if there are abstractions in that world, that there couldn't be abstractions of that other world. And that is precisely what the argument is of our colleagues. They are abstractions of that world, and after all, everything is abstraction, and it's an empirical matter, and there's nothing to be said theoretically about it. We used to believe that. We wrote a couple of books that argued that on empirical grounds, the REH models didn't work. We're after something a little bigger, perhaps. We're after the theoretical argument. So we show in the paper that REH models are abstractions of irrational decision-making in real-world markets in which knowledge self-evidently grows. So now we have we're at the fork. We can say economics cannot be based on rational decision-making. REH doesn't serve the function. We don't really have the alternative. Everything is irrational. We don't really have economic theory in sense of explaining longer-term regularities. So we want to try something else. So the starting point of what we want to try is Soros's fallibility principle. Unanticipated changes in knowledge of the process underpinning aggregates play a central role in driving outcomes, especially in financial markets. I think George had shown this without any doubt to be of tremendous social and practical importance. But then we want to do a little more. We want to replace the theory. We don't want just an empirical argument. So where is the theory? The theory actually comes from Karl Popper. What is the model on which the economist will base its notion of rationality on? There will be a partly open model. So partly open models are formal abstractions of the world of fallibility. And I mean formal. We actually present such models in our paper. So this is not, so that takes us to the end of this, namely to the contingent expectations hypothesis. This is the hypothesis that is, if you will, a rational expectations analog of rational decision, of models that are compatible with rational decision making in real-world markets in which knowledge grows. It rests on two principles. It rests on Karl Popper's insight that recognizing the growth of knowledge is crucial for developing empirically relevant economic models. It also rests on the fallibility as a fulcrum of this, of George's fallibility, one of the two Siamese twins, as George put it. And it rests on John Muth's, Robert Lucas's insights, which we also accept, that we cannot have economic models that are incoherent, that assume that the model predicts regularities in the aggregate that are not attributed on an individual level. No, this has nothing to do with individuals behaving in a coherent way. This is a modeling principle. And it has nothing to do with this being mechanical. In fact, this admits radical uncertainty. It admits unanticipated change. It admits all of these things that we've been talking about for a long time. The question is, what is the underlying structure? How do you write down on the basis of which you do rationality? Once that happens, some interesting things happen. And here they are. The first thing that happens is an insight of John Maynard Keynes, my favorite quote in John Maynard Keynes, that rational people rely on psychological and social considerations and not just on calculation. But note the word rational. Keynes never was of the view that, that psychology is a symptom of irrationality. For Keynes, as we argue in our latest book, for Keynes, psychology was a necessary concomitant of decision-making in a world of fallibility and imperfect knowledge. I'm done almost. And then there's another thing that was swept away by the rational expectations revolution, by the use of determinate models, was the fundamental insight of Edmund Phelps that autonomous expectations are crucial for understanding outcomes. This is a little too technical, but rational expectations are all endogenous. Those come back without assumption of irrationality. So here we have all the major advances of the last 40 years of macroeconomics with one change. We move from a world of perfect knowledge to the world of fallibility. That brings back rational expectations view about coherence, the importance of fundamentals, the importance of psychology, and the importance of autonomous expectations. Now you could ask the question, does this have an empirical content? We have a whole session about the empirical content application to specific problems, but as we will try to, with our wonderful group of students, persuade you that CEH, in fact, imposes sufficient structural models so they have empirical implications, and they can resolve puzzles that have confounded the conventional approach for decades. Thank you.
My first reaction to the title of this session was, I wish it had been not just time and expectations, but time, memory, and expectations. I think we talked too little about memory. A friend of mine, Leijonhufvud, 30 years ago, did a study of people's inflation expectations. He had a foresight, or maybe it's hindsight, to ask them also about their memories. And this was a study of 4,000 respondents. And what he found, I think, surprised most economists. What he found was that people's memories of the immediately past inflation were just as bad as their forecast of the coming inflation. This is, I think, something that we should think more about. Okay, now the next speaker is Guesnerie.
Oh, yes. So what should I do? Okay. Okay, thank you. I will start by reminding you the failure of economic theory, of the economic profession in the recent crisis. Okay, there were so few warnings that we have to call that a failure. What are the reasons for this failure? I tend to put emphasis on three main reasons. Maybe it's not exhaustive, but that's my view of the point. First, I think there is a dimension of balkanization of economic knowledge. Okay, we have the profession has produced a lot of knowledge, but on the fronts which are closer and closer, smaller and smaller. Okay, and with less and less communication between the different places where knowledge is produced. Okay, I think it's clear even in finance, for example, which is a subset of knowledge. The second, after that, there are two methodological questions that come out. The first one is that questioning the rationality of Homo economicus. Okay, if you read Paul Krugman, for example, you see that he says repeatedly that people are less rational than we assume, and that's certainly true, and it's something that Roman said too also. And the third one is questioning the rationality of expectations. And that's a different issue, and that's my point. That was also partly Roman Frydman point. We have complementary views, more than conflicting, but certainly not exactly the same. And I would like to make an advertisement for INET, which is the International Network on Expectational Coordination, which I am coordinating. And INET exists because of INET. It's not INET because it has an INET grant, and gathers beside the Paris node 12 nodes in the world, including in the US, Stanford, Princeton, NYU, Columbia, etc. In Europe, Amsterdam, Barcelona, Zurich. Elsewhere, Jerusalem, Beijing, Tokyo, Santiago de Chile. Okay, so that's an advertisement for this network if you want to know more about it. Now, the expectation is an interesting subject because it has appeared rather recently in economic thought. Okay, you have not much discussion on expectation in the 19th century. It comes with Keynes, okay, and it becomes very prominent after Moose. Okay, Moose after Moose, so the beginning of the 60s, the rational expectation hypothesis becomes hegemonic in economic theory. I mean by formalized economic theory. You will say mainstream, I will agree with that. So what did Moose argue is that the people of the economic agenda refer to the relevant economic theory. And that implies that they don't make systematic mistakes, okay? They have rational expectation, okay? So the rational expectation hypothesis, the success of rational expectation hypothesis certainly relates to the fact that there is rational. Okay, economists like to be viewed as rational, and the question is, it's a little bit ambiguous, okay? It's rational to have rational expectation when others have rational expectation. It's not rational to have rational expectation when others do not have rational expectation. Okay, it's a Nash equilibrium, not a dominant strategy. Okay, so it's a much weaker concept than rationality, and it's a different concept in itself. Now, since the 70s, the rational expectation hypothesis has taken over all fields, general equilibrium, but that's rather natural, finance, but also macroeconomic theory with the real business cycle models and even the new Keynesian model now. Okay, so that raises a number of questions. I will discuss about this question. Okay, is it a deus ex machina, a reasonable assumption, a rather blind point of economic theory? That are the questions. In order to illustrate the critical assessment I will provide, I thought, given the title of this session, I should give you this pamphlet that appeared in the Financial Times in March 2009, signed on Willem Buiter. Okay, say, today's asset price depends on today's anticipation of tomorrow's price, and tomorrow's price likewise depends on tomorrow's expectation on the price the day after tomorrow, ad nauseam. Since there is no obvious finite terminal time for the universe, few macroeconomists study cosmology in their spare time. Most economic models with rational asset pricing imply that today's price depends in part on today's anticipation of the asset price in the infinitely remote future. And it continues, okay, he said that all this contradiction is solved by some kind of transversality condition that goes to infinity. And he claims that, but in a decentralized market economy, there is no mathematical programmer imposing the terminal boundary condition to make sure that everything will be all right. Okay, so he basically argued that the way we, let's say, formalize economic theory deals with expectation in models with time horizon is unsatisfactory for very basic reason that we have to go to what happens at infinity makes sense. Okay, I will say a few things on that later, but that's a starting point. Now, is it the case that nothing has been done and the rational expectation hypothesis has been taken uncritically in the profession, even before the crisis? Okay, what I will say here, naturally, is more convincing after the crisis. So I will give you a few lines of the critical assessment of the rational expectation hypothesis that are in the literature, that are developing, or that are borne by the people who are in the network in X, for example, okay, in which we don't agree, but we all agree to disagree, okay? So here are the way to disagree. So the first time of criticism, I called it internal. Okay, I refer to the Marxist terminology of my years. Okay, you had internal criticism of the capitalism and external criticism. Okay, first internal criticism is rather obvious. Okay, what is the relevant theory if there are many? Okay, it relates with multiplicity. Okay, and there is a lot of literature. I was involved in the sunspot literature, for example. There are other views on the multiplicity, which I mentioned here with the global games. Now, along the line of internal criticism, also there is a literature called herd behavior that shows that in some contexts you have a very poor aggregation of information. Okay, aggregation of information in a society may be very poor, and aggregate information as coming from the behavior of people in a given society may be very poor for reasons I will not explain here. You have a fragile equilibrium. What I call external criticism question really the plausibility of the robustness of the equilibrium. Okay. And there are, I put here two directions. The one I call the inductive viewpoint, that's my preferred viewpoint, the one I have tried to develop in my research, which try to criticize the rational expectation equilibrium from the viewpoint of rationality, showing that it cannot be common knowledge in some sense, or that in some cases it can be common knowledge, in some cases it cannot be. It can be also called inductive learning. Now you also a very standard way to look at that, which is real-time learning. Okay, it's basing what you do on memory to reflect what Axel said a moment. Okay, in which people change their view of the world depending on what happens. Okay, and they change it progressively, and maybe at the end you come to the rational expectation equilibrium. Maybe you don't go. Okay, but you learn. Okay. Now, under the heading of external criticism, also I put some different direction of reflection. Some people have argued that, for example, the fact that there is no common knowledge of the exogenous uncertainty. Okay, in uncertainty, you have also internal uncertainty and external uncertainty. I could say intrinsic or extrinsic. External uncertainty comes from nature. Okay, it's because you cannot predict some of the things. Internal uncertainty comes from the fact that you cannot predict what the other will do. Okay, and that's really what the Gordian knot that the rational expectation hypothesis tries to cut. That's why you have also the IKE, the imperfect knowledge economics, which was presented by Roman a moment ago. Okay, in my view, I gave one slide on this inductive viewpoint. The inductive viewpoint, it can be very abstract or, in fact, very concrete. Okay, the idea is to assess the elasticity of realization to expectations. Okay, is it the case that you're in a world in which if there are small mistakes in expectation, the world will be very different? Or is it the case that if you have small mistake in expectation, the world will be the same? Okay, in a case, what you could call the convention will be stable. In the other case, it will not be stable. And that's the idea of inductive learning. Okay, that's really what you find. Okay, if you find that realization are not very sensitive to expectation, then you think that you will stick to the rational expectation hypothesis. If you think that they are very sensitive, then you don't know what you should do. Okay, you have another world which is open, and that's it may be a very broad world. The set of rationalizable equilibria is very large, by the way. Okay, and on which you have Knightian uncertainty. So my view is that kind of approach echoes what George Soros called reflexivity. Okay, it's based on the connection between what happens in your mind and what happens in the real world. Now, I'll give you here, also there is a connection between the inductive viewpoint and the evolutive viewpoint, okay, the learning in real time or learning in virtual time. Okay, I will not go further on that. Okay. No, I want to make, I have only a few minutes. I want to say that if you accept this view, this critical view, you have, the feeling you have on a number of questions is different. Okay, and there are three questions on which I wish to say it changed your feelings. Okay, the first one is question of new financial instrument. The standard theory with rational expectation says it's good, okay, because it improves insurance possibilities. Okay, if you take the critical view I am suggesting, the answer is different, because it may be the case that new financial instruments improve the possibility of insurance, but destroy the possibility of expectational coordination. That's the first point. Second point is efficient market hypothesis. Okay, with rational expectation hypothesis, you have very nice models. Some of them are critical, as the Grossman-Stiglitz model. A very nice model which explains why information is well transmitted. If you put this robustness issue, then you realize that it's not true. It's not true. In particular, the market cannot transmit too much information. So you have a different view of this question. The third one is about long-lived agent, real business cycle models. Okay, with real business cycle models, the permanent income hypothesis kills the Keynesian multiplier. I argue that the long life hypothesis, in which people have long life but very long horizon for expectation, kills the plausibility of good expectational coordination. So that Keynes back through the window. Provisional conclusion. I am coming back to something that was a kind of axiom of economic theory, a formalized economic theory, the one I am familiar with. And this axiom is that the plausibility of coordination in the sense of the rational expectation hypothesis is constant across situations. Okay. I don't disagree that in some cases the rational expectation hypothesis may be good. I don't think it's constant across situations. I think that it's strictly unbelievable. Okay. And so naturally, when you accept that, when the rational expectation hypothesis is not the good reference, what should you do? You enter what I call the wild world of non-rational expectation hypothesis. And in a sense, Roman also introduced this wild world of non-rational expectation hypothesis in a different way. Okay. And it's not very popular in the profession. Why? Because the profession is basically attached to what I call philosophical determinism. Okay? We are a science, okay? Once initial conditions are known, then we should be able to predict the history, what will happen later. Okay, that's philosophical determinism. It's really deeply rooted in our profession, and it has to be changed in a sense. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, I think you all know that in George Soros' theory of reflexivity, beliefs about the future lead people to take current decisions that will produce the actual future. Now, rational expectations is the very special case of reflexivity, where the decisions taken actually do produce the future that was expected. Now, if it were the case that rational expectations theory was true, Mr. Soros would never have made any money. INET would not have been created, and we would not be here today. So you see, your presence here today strikes me as pretty conclusive evidence of the falsity of rational expectations.
Okay. Well, I'm afraid I have to start with an apology, because I really was not prepared to make a presentation. I think the organizers assumed that I'm familiar with my theory, or I remember my theory, but actually I only remember the future. And so I think I just have to have you'll get a stream of consciousness presentation, not an organized one. So I think when Lehman Brothers declared bankruptcy, that was a bankruptcy, an intellectual bankruptcy of an entire conceptual or axiomatic system on which a lot of the activities in the financial markets were at that time based. And I think economic theory has to be reconsidered from the ground up, because economics sought to pursue a goal which is unattainable. It sought to produce universally valid generalizations which could be used interchangeably, reversibly, both to predict and to explain phenomena. Now, this is possible in natural science. So let's say thank you. Newtonian physics really produced great insights, and I think economists were actually trying to imitate that model. I call it physics envy. And that, I think, is unattainable. So you have to, there is a fundamental difference in the subject matter of physics and economics. And the main difference is that economics or social phenomena generally have thinking participants. And their role, those participants, their thinking, the relationship between their thinking and the actual state of affairs, there's basically two functions connects them. The cognitive function and the what I call the manipulative function. And those two functions interfere with each other, and so neither function is complete by itself and does not give you determinate results. And that creates what I call the human uncertainty principle, which is simply absent in the natural phenomena. The scientists engage in, have a cognitive function, and the laws and generalizations that they can produce can then be used to manipulate nature. So there is a cognitive function and a manipulative function connected with natural science. But it is possible to keep the two of them separate. And because of that, each function actually does what it's supposed to do. And, namely, you actually gain knowledge. Cognitive function produces knowledge. And the knowledge can be used to manipulate nature. In other words, you can use it to serve your purposes. In social affairs, this separation cannot be achieved. The two functions interfere with each other. So as a result, the understanding of the participants is always imperfect. They can't base their decisions on knowledge. They may have a certain amount of knowledge, but it's not enough for their decisions, because they need to actually be able to anticipate the future, and that future is dependent on the decisions that people are making today. And those decisions are based not on facts, not on knowledge, but on a bias or a hunch. And you have, especially when you have a number of participants, you just simply can't know what those decisions are going to be. So that's the principle of fallibility. And then the results of your actions are, will not correspond to your expectations. So that's a part of this situation. Now, the two functions create a feedback loop. People, in their attempt to understand the world, learn from experience. They observe what happens, and they adjust their thinking according to the experience that they gain. And similarly, so so that's one part of the loophole. And the change in their thinking then affects the course of affairs. Now, I think this, by now, fallibility is pretty well recognized. And you have, I think, the emerging study of behavioral economics. In other words, observe how people actually make their decisions and how those decisions are different from what could be expected according to the rational expectations or rational choice theory. And I think that is a great insight, but it's only half of reflexivity, because it does not take into account the impact that the learning process has on the actual state of affairs, on the structure on reality, on the organizations that are functioning, and the real world that people have to make their decisions about. So that's the conceptual framework that I have developed. I've of course particularly applied it to the financial markets because I was myself engaged in the financial markets, although I developed this theory actually long before I became engaged in financial markets. I didn't actually think it would be helpful there, but it turned out to be so. And actually, it turned out that a framework which contends that there is an uncertainty which makes it impossible to predict the future actually can enable you to make better predictions than the one that has proven to be false. Now, that's actually rather peculiar, and I have to explain it, how I have used it as a market participant. And actually, since it was Karl Popper and his writings that have led me to develop this conceptual framework. And the one big difference that I have with him is that I disagree with his theory of social science, or rather the doctrine of the unity of science. He contended that the same methods and criteria apply both to social science and natural science. And I think that actually is wrong. And yet, it's also Karl Popper's theory of social science and of the logic of scientific discovery, and particularly his idea of conjectures and refutations was the stimulus to my applying this approach to predicting financial markets. And that is that I have actually used Popper's theory of the logic of scientific discovery, that scientists are supposed to formulate a hypothesis, which they then submit to testing. And that's exactly what I did as a market participant. And I also assumed that that's in fact what the financial markets are doing, even though the participants may not be aware of it. But actually markets do exactly the same thing. And markets have this rather useful characteristic that the decisions of the market participants can be aggregated and are actually reported every day or every minute in the form of market prices. So therefore, in formulating my hypothesis, I could compare my expectations with the prevailing market expectations. And if there was a big difference, that gave me a profit opportunity. And the bigger the difference, the bigger the opportunity. Now, actually, Popper, in his writings, had a similar statement, as sort of qualifying the merits of economic or scientific theories. And that was roundly criticized by philosophers of science, saying that that predictive value can't be quantified. Well, they may be right about science, but actually, as a market participant, that actually could be quantified. So, as I say, the more my hypothesis was different from the market price, which was which is an aggregation of market expectations. The bigger opportunity I had. And then, of course, when events don't comply with my expectations, I have to revise them, review them, and decide who is wrong. Was I wrong, or is the market wrong? And if I'm wrong, then of course I can correct it. And if the market is wrong, then I would actually increase my bet, because the profit opportunity has actually increased. But in doing that, I had to be constantly taking into account the risk that my evaluation may be wrong. And in fact, it may be right some of the time, but it's bound to be wrong sometime also. So it then becomes a question of let's say, not risk management, but uncertainty management. And you do need a much bigger margin for error than, let's say, financial institutions have allowed themselves, as we heard last night from Adair Turner. So that's the way it works as a market participant, and I think it can also work in policy prescriptions. And there you have my writings, particularly now with the Euro crisis, which then on the basis of which you can evaluate whether it works or not. But it was really quite remarkable in this remarkable series of misconceptions. And again, as Turner pointed out, that all these nasty results are unavoidable, and yet we don't seem to be able to avoid them. So I think this approach I find very fruitful, but I also have to admit, and I was thinking of it as potentially offering a new paradigm for understanding particularly financial markets and monetary phenomena. But it doesn't qualify for that because it hasn't really been yet developed into a usable approach for modeling. And I think that there's a potential for that, and I hope that it will be developed, and I think it is already, a number of people are working on it, where actually the example of predator and prey, the survival and replication of species provides a very good starting point for modeling this kind of human uncertainty and reflexive phenomena. And instead of a species, you have to take ideas that can either propagate themselves and gain adherence or be rejected and lose their influence. Now, obviously, we are talking about apples and oranges when we are talking about species and memes. But nevertheless, as a method, I think that is, to me, the most promising way forward. Now, I don't know how long I should go on, but I should have really explained that the key to generalizing about reflexivity is that feedback actually can be classified into positive and negative feedback. And negative feedback corrects misconceptions. And positive feedback actually reinforces both the prevailing trend and a prevailing interpretation. And that then the positive feedback, the negative feedback actually, as an extreme case, would lead you to a rational expectations world, where everybody would finally recognize the one set of expectations which actually would correspond to what actually happens. That's an extreme case. So what is the central case for rational expectations is an extreme case for my conceptual framework. But the positive feedback can reinforce each other, but not indefinitely, because eventually the the expectations will be so far removed from the actual state of situations that it has to be recognized that there is a misconception involved. So I won't go into further details. That's really more or less a presentation of an alternative way of looking at the course of events. Thank you.
Well, we have just a few minutes left. I had one point I wanted to make, and that is when we're dealing with a system that has gotten unstable, we may not be justified in our habit of thinking of probability distributions as single-peaked. We have many examples where a credit crash in Latin America, for example, in trying to save the banking system, a government intervenes, injects money to save the depositors, and the result is almost immediate, very high inflation. And we have other cases, present one, where you do intervene, but the deflationary pressure just persists and persists and persists. And so in the unstable system, the usual way of thinking of expectations and thinking of the probability distributions turns out not to be the right thing. A few questions and answers. John Kay.
I think this is the most important session of the conference, and I want to pick out what I think is a key theme that unites everything all five of you, of some of what all five of you have said. And this is really about what we mean as economists by rationality. Because as economists, we've typically meant rationality is consistency. And that isn't the ordinary sense of rationality. Banging your head against a brick wall is consistent, but it's not rational. In fact, rationality is not persisting in a course of action which is unsuccessful and expecting to get different results. Banging your head against a brick wall is not rational. Now, as far as we are concerned in risk and uncertainty, we've used that principle, and financial economics for the last 50 years has been based on the idea that we can characterize risk and uncertainty essentially by personal or subjective probabilities that are maintained consistently. Now, that's an approach that works probably for a certain rather narrow kind of epistemic uncertainty, the kind of uncertainty that involves not knowing the value of a particular parameter. But the majority of situations we face in business and finance, the ones we've been talking about in this session, are actually situations which are typically ill-defined, open-ended. We don't know the complete set of possible outcomes, and we may not actually know what the outcome is even after the event. And we can't characterize these kind of events by consistent personal probabilities. The way we typically do characterize them, actually, is by narrative, stories, finding some kind of overarching narrative that seems to describe to us what's going on. And if we look back at that 2007 crisis and the run-up to it, we can see two alternative explanations of what were going on then. One, which was the prevailing narrative, was that it was actually based on this standard financial economics model, a story in which people were finding ever more sophisticated mechanisms for slicing and dicing risks and allocating them efficiently. The other was that by virtue of believing this overarching narrative, people were led to take risks which actually it was inappropriate for them to take. And in retrospect, we know very clearly that it was the second explanation, not the first one, that was actually right. And one of the biggest things we ought to do is learn from that. And that means that what we ought to be doing is not imposing an axiomatic model of how we think people might behave in a certain kind of risky situation on people's behavior everywhere. It's trying to understand better how people in business and finance actually do cope with this very inchoate uncertainty which they typically face. And if they do it via narratives and the like, that's not because they're irrational. It's because it's actually the only way of dealing with that kind of ill-defined uncertainty. And that's where we need to be, and that's one of the most important pieces of new economic thinking that we ought to be doing.
Okay, I hope I have 3 people, and you have to be brief. Paul Davidson.
Paul Davidson, Journal of Post-Keynesian Economics. When I was in Cambridge, Joan Robinson always used to tell me, time is a device which prevents everything from happening at once, and space is a device which prevents everything from happening in Cambridge. Now, Mr. Soros was attacked by The Economist magazine when he first put out his reflexivity, that he did not understand what science is, and he correctly responded to them, pointing out that Paul Samuelson had said that if we're going to be a science, we have to accept the ergodic stochastic theory. Ergodic theory is science can predict the future by looking at the past. Let me just point out, and non-ergodic means that past data doesn't allow you to say anything about the future. Let me just point out that even in the natural sciences, there are sciences that cannot predict the future. Darwin's theory of evolution can explain how the species arrived, but can't tell you what the next species is going to be. So economics can be a science which can explain the past, but need not predict the future. I've called non-ergodic economics the economics of uncertainty. Let me then say, we know time is a device which prevents everything from happening at once. You make a decision today, the payoff is always going to be sometime in the future. How do we protect ourselves? And the answer is money contracts. That is, we are, by entering into all sorts of contracts, we can assure cash inflows and cash outflows as long as everybody meets their contractual obligations. Financial markets are liquidity markets which allow fast exits if people stop making their explanations. And once we understand what we're dealing with in non-ergodic science, and the essence of a capitalist system is money contracts which force people to do things into the future which may or may not be in their best interest at any time, we will make some great advances, as Mr. Soros has tried in financial markets.
Roger.
Sorry. Thank you. This is really a question. All of the discussions about memory, expectations, uncertainty, all are applied in financial terms. One component of INET is looking at a very different set of transactions. The Human Capital and Economic Opportunity Global Working Group is looking at uncertainty as it affects human capital development. And I invite the panel, and it's too late in the day to ask for speculations on this, but we have to know how expectations and memory affect parent decisions about the children they're going to have, how much they're going to invest in them. They affect societal decisions about what kinds of resources are going to be allocated to nutrition, healthcare, and education. This, in turn, affects, over time, opportunity inequality, income inequality. So those in this room who think that income inequality is an issue that they need to wrestle with, that it has an impact on political and domestic stability, need to be also thinking about how expectations and, say, the memory of culture and the change of culture affects some sort of sense of rising radical uncertainty. And that affects then than family and societal behavior towards younger people. So this is really a question that if we had time, I'd be asking the panel to just take the time to speculate on how this kind of uncertainty that they've talked about in the various forms affects human capital development, ultimately economic opportunity.
Okay, so the last question.
A question and a brief anecdote to back it up. I'd wonder the panel's feeling about whether the economic obsession with trying to model everything from the individual up, the focus on the agent to derive the system, is part of why we get our knickers in a twist about the whole concept of uncertainty. We hypothesize this hyper-rational extension of an individual as our way of seeing how the entire system operates, whereas genuine sciences tend to work from systemic levels down. One of my favorite anecdotes about that, my own experience, is after first presenting my Minsky model to my now defunct Department of Economics, one of my neoclassical colleagues challenged me and said, "Steve, the difference between me and you is I believe people learn from their mistakes." And I said, "Yes, Andrew, the other difference is I believe people forget and die."
Okay. I think that we have to quit, and let's just thank our 4 speakers and move on. And that was our time with a loudspeaker.
Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, I have a quick announcement about the special YSI program this afternoon and the breakout session. I will announce it quickly in Chinese and then in English. 亲爱的学生朋友们，今天下午有一个特别的环节在 YSI， 就是我们有 INET 新经济研究所的学者会下去跟学生互动，包括Neil Ferguson 沈连涛博士 Barry Ankengreen 还有特纳勋爵，他们今天下午呢都会跟学生互动。那么这个行程安排都在学生下面房间的墙壁上，大家请注意一下时间。We have 2 quick announcements. The first one is about a special program for YSI. This afternoon we have INET economists to go down to the YSI room to interact with students and take questions. We have economists such as Niall Ferguson, Andrew Shen, Barry Ankengreen, Lord Adele Turner, and other economists. So we hope students will wait in the room, and the schedule is on the wall of the room as well. So we hope to see a lot of participation. Another announcement is about the breakout session this afternoon. From 2:45 to 4:30, from 2:45 to 4:30, we have the first breakout at first floor Cyprus Maple Room, Session A, the Imperfect Knowledge Economics Approach to Modeling an Open World. On the second floor of the function rooms at the Willow Cherry Beach Room, B67, is Session B, What is the Role of Psychological Considerations in Economics? So we have Session A and Session B starting now on the first floor and second floor. We look forward to your participation. Thank you.